In the Planescape campaign setting for D&D, there are three main types of planes, or realms of existence. The prime material plane, which you could think of as the natural world. There's the outer planes, which act as afterlives, the planes of morality and philosophy, which I covered in a previous video. And then there's the inner planes, which are places of mostly pure elemental energy. They constitute the building blocks of matter in the universe. This video is about those. There's also the transitive planes, those being the astral and the ethereal, the go-between planes that connect the three I just mentioned, but those will have to wait for a future video. The inner planes are planes of extremes, and generally are places comprised of or devoted to a single substance. As a general rule, they're very hostile places that mortals aren't meant to live in. There's 18 inner planes in all, and they're organized in the following way. There are 4 main elemental planes: fire, air, water, and earth. And there are 2 energy planes, positive energy and negative energy. The 4 main elemental planes don't connect to each other directly, except through special vortices that essentially act as portals, but they do connect through the para-elemental planes: smoke, magma, ooze, and ice. These planes form a sort of halfway point between the main elemental planes. Then there are 8 quasi-elemental planes, which connect the main elemental planes to the energy planes: lightning, radiance, mineral, steam, vacuum, ash, dust, and salt. Now, the way in which these planes connect seems to me to be up for some interpretation. But before I get to that, I should say that for this video, and for all of my other Planescape videos so far, I've been using original Planescape from AD&D 2nd edition as my source material. I haven't really been going off what other editions have added about the outer planes, or about Sigil, or about the inner planes, or certainly not the Shadowfell or Feywild. Those didn't even exist back in AD&D 2nd edition. I also know there's now a Planescape campaign setting book for D&D 5th edition. This video is about the OG stuff, which is still just as good today as it ever was for fitting into your D&D campaigns or just for general world-building inspiration. So that being said, the original Planescape campaign setting talks about the inner planes in a few different ways. On the one hand, it says that except for the ring road of the outer planes, which is just a series of portals anyway, you can't just walk or fly or sail from plane to plane, implying that each plane is a self-contained space where special means of traveling from one to another, such as portals or elemental vortices, must be found. But on the other hand, it talks about traversing planar borders as if you can walk straight from the plane of fire to the plane of ash, for example, making the inner planes sometimes seem more like one giant plane where you could, in theory, zoom out and see it all at once. I prefer to think of the inner planes as actually separate spaces, because if they're not, then why are we calling them individual planes? But no matter how you think of it, the inner planes border each other in enough of a real sense that the effects of one plane bleed into its neighbors. So even if you can't walk from the plane of water to the plane of salt, you know you're getting close to the plane of salt when the water becomes more and more salty. In addition to these bleed-over effects, most planes contain pockets of other nearby planes. You can find pockets of negative energy floating about in the plane of dust, or pockets of water meandering in the plane of air, and so on. Whether you conceptualize the inner planes as being one contiguous space or 18 distinct yet connected spaces, they're all infinite. Though they might not be infinite in all directions. For instance, if while in the plane of Earth, you travel toward the plane of magma, the Earth gives way more and more to magma, so that at a certain point, you either just hit the boundary of the plane of Earth, or you enter the plane of magma, depending on how you like to imagine it. So, presumably, there is an end to the plane of Earth in that direction. But the plane of Earth extends infinitely upward and downward, as well as in the directions not leading to other planes. Basically, if you look at this image and try to think of it more as a 3-dimensional object, then in the directions radiating out from the center of the shape, each plane can go on infinitely. Aside from the dangerous and mostly inhospitable nature of the inner planes, being in the inner planes poses some constraints on magic. In hot planes, such as the plane of magma, fire spells won't really have any effect since everything is already on fire, and water or ice spells will be at reduced effectiveness or will fizzle out completely, and vice versa for the cold planes. Also, summoning or conjuration spells can only reach as far as the plane you're currently in and its neighbors. These sorts of challenges can be overcome with things called spell keys, which are essentially semi-secret augmentations to your spells that allow you to attune to the plane you're in to make your magic work properly. Each plane has its own keys, and I say semi-secret because most planar beings know that the spell keys exist, though they might not know what the keys are for planes that aren't their own. On to the planes themselves. There are 4 major elemental planes. Air. The plane of air is essentially an endless sky. It's a brilliant blue, said to look like the sky viewed from the highest mountaintop. There's no surface below. The only surfaces you're going to find in the plane of air are drifting chunks of earth floating around that have come in from other planes. Some of these sky islands are big enough to contain palaces or cities, such as the Citadel of Ice and Steel. Earth isn't the only thing that drifts in from other planes. You might find floating spheres of water, fire, salt, or whatever else the inner planes contain. The plane of air is one of the few hospitable planes to outsiders, as there's actually a breathable atmosphere here, and unless you get too close to the borders of the less hospitable planes, the temperature is quite livable. The biggest struggle for an outsider to the plane of air is probably finding a way to fly, otherwise your visit will consist of falling through the air forever, unless you're lucky enough to find a floating island to safely land on. One interesting thing about the plane of air is that the notions of up and down are subjective. The plane orients itself to the beliefs of its inhabitants. If a group of people believe that a certain direction is down, the rain will fall in that direction, and so will they. Another group close by could believe down is in another direction. On the plane of air, you could find one group living on one side of a floating island, and another group living on the other side, both living within completely different local gravities. This also means that you fall in whatever direction you believe down to be. So you could be falling through the sky and pass right by someone who's falling up from your perspective, or sideways. Natives of the plane of air don't experience this though, as up and down are foreign notions that you have to take with you to the plane of air. Similarly, the cardinal directions are meaningless in this plane, and really all of the inner planes. Instead, the inhabitants of the inner planes refer to the directions of other nearby inner planes, in this case being smoke, void, or vacuum, storm, or lightning, and ice. The plane of air is connected to the plane of water through a giant vortex of water called the waterspout, which isn't too far from the Citadel of Ice and Steel. This plane is pretty heavily populated with all sorts of flying creatures, such as air elementals, air mephits, and djinn. Mephits are humanoid-looking trickster elementals that can be found all over the inner planes, except for the positive and negative energy planes. Each of the main elemental planes is home to a different type of genie, and for the plane of air, that's the djinn. Earth. The plane of Earth, perhaps unsurprisingly, is comprised of endless earth. Just like the plane of air, but kind of in the opposite way, there is no surface. It's a bit like being underground always. In fact, for the most part, it's just solid earth and stone, though occasionally you can find open spaces within that rock, such as caverns, tunnels, or small pockets, sometimes filled with air from the plane of air, other times filled with water, or magma, or minerals from their respective planes. Being a dense realm of rock and stone, there's essentially no landmarks to guide your way, which is a recurring problem in navigating many of the inner planes. Though there are a few notable places, such as the Great Dismal Delve, which is a gigantic series of caverns where the Khan of the Tao resides. The Tao are a race of earthen genie slavers. There's also the Pale River and the Iron Crucible, which are vortices to the planes of water and fire, respectively. The plane of Earth, if you can't tell already, is not very hospitable to outsiders. For one thing, unless you manage to find a pocket of air somewhere, and not all caverns and open spaces in the plane of Earth have air, as the plane itself has no natural air supply, there's nothing to breathe. There's no light, unless you bring your own, or find some glowing mushrooms or minerals somewhere. There's no food or drink, unless you stumble across a patch of water from the plane of water, or a cave full of mushrooms. But most importantly, it's incredibly difficult to get anywhere, as most of the plane is solid earth. Being such an impenetrable place, the plane of Earth is a popular spot for people to be banished to or for people to store treasures or hide evil artifacts. Just like the plane of air, up and down are subjective, with the plane accommodating whatever you believe. though it should be noted that people with different senses of what's down converge after a few moments of meeting one another so that their downs are the same. Down is decided by whoever has the highest wisdom, with intelligence breaking ties. That, by the way, is also true for the plane of air. And here, too, the natives of the plane of earth don't have these difficulties. The neighboring planes are ooze, mineral, magma, and dust. Water. The plane of water feels rather gentle compared to the plane of earth and the plane of fire, which I'll get to next. It's an endless expanse of blue-green water, with no surface and no bottom. Nonetheless, in some places coral reefs extend up from the infinite depths. The most elaborate and extensive of these is the Citadel of 10,000 Pearls, which is ruled over by the Marids, water genies, who are typically much nicer and more noble than the genies of the other planes, especially the genies of earth and fire. The Jinn, too, are pretty nice. The Citadel of 10,000 Pearls isn't far from the bubble net, the vortex to the plane of air. The neighboring planes are ice, steam, ooze, and salt. As you get closer to the plane of ice, the water becomes cold. Near steam, the water starts to boil. Near ooze, the water becomes thick and slimy. And near salt, it becomes bitter. The plane of water is less hospitable than the plane of air, because there's no air to breathe, except for a few pockets here and there that drift in. But if you can find a way to breathe, such as by wearing a ring of water breathing, then the plane of water becomes rather hospitable. Just like the planes of air and earth, there is no up and down here. But in the plane of water, that's not really a problem. You can drift in any direction at any angle without feeling any disorientation. That being said, the plane of water can still be quite dangerous, as the waters are filled with life, such as sharks, krakens, and sea creatures of unimaginable size, as well as elementals of all sorts. Fire. The plane of fire, unlike the planes of earth, air, and water, resembles a normal landscape, except for the fact that everything is covered in flame. Where a normal landscape would have water, the plane of fire has seas of flame. In fact, the majority of the plane is a flaming ocean. To the untrained eye, the plane of fire is easily mistaken for one of the layers of Beitor or Carcerai. The plane of fire is considered the most powerful of all the elemental planes, as fire destroys everything it touches. For this reason, pockets of other elements are quite rare to find here. This plane is ruled over by the Ifrit, another race of slaving genies, essentially the fire equivalent of the Tao, whose seat of power is the City of Brass, floating amidst a sea of fire. Nearby the City of Brass is Jamal Turab, the Mount of Dust. The top of this mountain is where the vortex to the plane of air is located, taking the shape of a plume of smoke. The neighboring planes are Magma, Smoke, Radiance, and Ash. The plane of fire is one of the least hospitable and most evil inner planes. Not only is everything on fire, but the air itself is a scorching fume that will kill any who breathe it, unless they come prepared with proper magical protections or possess a natural immunity to fire, like the Ifrit do. Any unprotected food, water, potions, or really anything else will burst into flame and be reduced to ashes within an instant. Without some sort of magical fire immunity, being on the plane of fire requires a successful saving throw versus a breath weapon, or its immediate death. And even if you do save, you suffer 5d10 damage every round. And in AD&D 2nd edition, which is the edition of D&D that Planescape was written for, and where I'm getting this information from, as I mentioned, 1 round is 1 minute, not 6 seconds, like it is in 5e. The plane of fire also stands apart from the planes of earth, air, and water in that it actually has a definite up and down. So at least once you've sorted out a way to protect yourself and all your items, and also a way to navigate the flaming seas, you don't have disorientation or subjective gravity to worry about. Though you do have the denizens of the plane to worry about, as the plane of fire is home to more dangerous creatures than any of the elemental planes. And whether that means there's a higher amount of dangerous creatures than other planes, or that the creatures here are the most dangerous of any plane, I'm really not sure. But either way, it's not exactly safe and welcoming. The energy planes. The inner planes aren't just elemental in nature. The 4 main elemental planes and the 4 para-elemental planes all are, but the quasi-elemental planes are a combination of not only the components of the elemental planes they border, but also of either positive or negative energy. Positive energy. The plane of positive energy isn't as peachy and inviting as it sounds, though. It's a place of raw, life-giving power, but too much of anything, even positive energy, becomes dangerous. It's also not a very fun plane to visit, as the whole plane is just an endless expanse of brilliant whiteness. There's no ground, no sky, no solid objects, no features whatsoever aside from the thrumming, burning, radiant energy. There aren't any inhabitants either, except for the Zagya, which are essentially the only beings capable of permanently surviving here, or at least nobody else that's capable of it wants to. Traveling the positive energy plane is described as being like swimming in an ocean of pure electricity, except rather than literally swimming, you move around through the power of thought. Though because the only thing around is pure energy, you're unlikely to find any points of reference to confirm that you really are moving. As I mentioned, this plane is actually incredibly dangerous. In fact, you're going to die here quite quickly unless you come equipped with protection. Each minute you spend here, you gain 2d6 hit points, healing you if needed, then adding to your total. Once you reach double your total, you burst into a brilliant white flame as your body can no longer contain all that energy. There's also no air here, so you've got to bring your own, and as ever, you've got to keep everything you bring protected from the plane's power. Seeing is also a problem, as the intense white light, which is even more intense than the plane of radiance, is instantly and permanently blinding. Negative energy. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the plane of negative energy. Where the positive energy plane was a bright place of overabundant life-giving power, the negative energy plane is a place of unmatched death, dread, and unspeakable blackness. Fittingly, it's also called the plane of death. Other names include the Black Barrier, the Great Void, and the Cold Land. This place is filled with a malevolent energy that drains the spirit from any being. Perhaps a bit surprisingly, this plane is far more inhabited than the plane of positive energy, though the inhabitants are all undead, aside from the Zegi, the negative energy equivalent of the Zagya. Also, unlike the positive energy plane, there is actually something here amidst all that blackness. The Fortress of the Soul, where the Dustmen, one of the factions of Sigil, keep their home away from home with great effort and dedication. There may be other structures here, but if they exist, nobody can see them through the impenetrable dark. Just like the positive energy plane, movement here is done through thought. Once again, there's little reason to go anywhere unless you happen to be a member of the Dustmen. This plane has no air, to be expected, and the life-draining force here causes 2d6 damage every minute. Once you die here, your spirit gets consumed by the plane and is impossible to be restored by any means. Not through resurrection spells, not even through wish. Your body joins the ranks of this plane's undead, eager to escape the negative energy plane and spread the darkness inside you. The para-elemental planes. Smoke. The para-elemental plane of smoke is at the intersection of air and fire. Because of this, it has some things in common with both planes. Like the plane of air, there is no ground. Gravity also follows the same rules as in the plane of air. Like the plane of fire, it's quite hot, though not scorching. As you might expect from this plane, breathing here is a problem. The air is nothing but choking smoke and brimstone, though it does clear up slightly the closer to the plane of air you get, while the closer to the plane of fire you get, the more extreme the temperature becomes. Expect to die here almost immediately from choking on the fumes, unless of course you come prepared with some apparatus or magical means of breathing, or if you stick to the border of the plane of air, where instead of dying you'll just take 1d10 damage every minute. Since the air here is so thick with smog, it's much harder to know where you're going compared to the plane of air. Pockets of earth are also way less common here, so the chunks of stuff to stand on are few and far between. There is at least one actual location within this plane though, the Choking Palace, where Ekak, the Smoldering Duke, self-proclaimed ruler of the plane, resides. The most prominent inhabitants of this plane are smoke mephits. The Jinn from the plane of air and Afrit from the plane of fire also can be found here, using this plane as their battlefield. Magma. The para-elemental plane of magma borders the planes of earth and fire, and is just as inhospitable. It's essentially a sea of lava, spewing from the plane of fire, then spreading in the direction of the plane of earth. By the plane of fire, you'll find geysers of flame, and by the plane of earth, you'll find cooling chunks of rock floating atop the magma. Chilimba, the first general of the cauldron and master of all mephits who rules over this plane, can be found in Caldera, his stronghold. I have a feeling most mephits don't acknowledge his title, but the fire and magma mephits that call this plane home probably do. Aside from mephits, Dao and Afrit can be found here. Some live here, but most come from their respective planes to trade, probably slaves. The fact that they come here to trade rather than fight goes to show that the Efreet are much more similar to the Dao than they are to the Jinn. Like the plane of fire, the Para-plane of Magma has a surface and an objective sense of up and down, though that won't really help you survive here. And also like the plane of fire, you'll need something to avoid getting burnt to a crisp. And just like the Para-plane of smoke, you'll need some way to avoid choking on the sulfurous fumes. You also have to be very careful walking on this plane, as the cooled magma crust that occasionally forms a walkable surface on top of the liquid magma is known to split without warning, leading unwary travelers to an immediate death. Ooze. The para-elemental plane of Ooze lies between the planes of earth and water, and much like the plane of water, it's an endless expanse of liquid in all directions with no discernible up or down. But unlike the plane of water, this liquid is thick, disgusting ooze, mud, and slime. This plane is also sometimes called the House of Chambered Madness, as it's a somewhat popular spot for tyrants or wizard tyrants to exile their enemies to, either leaving them to quickly die from choking on ooze, or to starve to death floating in a prison of air, drifting through the sea of sludge. The Para-plane of Ooze isn't a very inhabited place, though of course ooze mephits live here. Marids from the plane of water sometimes come here to hunt, and Dao come here to bathe. Movement through this plane is like moving through the plane of water, except swimming here is more difficult on account of the viscosity. You can also only see a few feet at best, and opening your eyes within this ooze probably isn't very healthy for them. If you go toward the plane of water, the ooze becomes thinner, clearer, and actually easy to swim through. If you go toward the plane of earth, it becomes drier and gritty. As you'd expect, there's no air here, and the Planescape sources don't say this, but I like to imagine that being in this plane is like being inside a gelatinous cube, so that you're slowly getting digested. Ice. The para-elemental plane of ice sits between water and air, but it's quite unlike both of them. It's an endless Arctic wasteland, with nothing but ice as far as the eye can see. Mostly it's flat expanses of glistening ice, but here and there mountains of ice protrude from the surface. I say that it's unlike its neighbor planes because there actually is a surface, and the gravity is normal, though the plane of ice has no bottom. If you dig into the layers of ice, you'll just find more layers, though you may also find hidden icy caverns, pockets of air, or even what's lurking below. If you venture to the coldest spot in the plane, you'll find the chiseled estate of Lord Cyrenax, most powerful of all ice elementals. Ice mephits live here as well, no surprise, and marids can sometimes be found here, scouring the plane in great hunts. While the air here is breathable, it's so cold that it hurts, causing 1d6 damage every minute to all who breathe it without protection. Also, if you're not dressed to handle the cold, you'll take another 1d6 every minute being here. Aside from that, and the frequent blizzards that will substantially reduce your visibility, and having nothing to eat, and the general lack of landmarks, this plane is relatively hospitable and easy to navigate. The quasi-elemental planes. Lightning. The quasi-elemental plane of lightning sits between the plane of air and the plane of positive energy, and as you might expect, is a mix of both. A vast sky rippling with crackling energy. The sky is filled with black clouds constantly bursting with thunder. Bolts of lightning arc between clouds, and the very air tingles with electricity. Like the plane of air, it's an endless sky with no surface, and gravity works the same. One interesting feature of this plane is that everybody within is constantly surrounded in St. Elmo's fire, also called witch fire. St. Elmo's fire is a real-world phenomenon in which a glowing plasma forms around objects in a strong electrical field. So essentially everybody is outlined in a layer of blue or purple plasma, even if you're invisible, making invisibility pretty useless here. This plane is inhabited mostly by lightning mephits, but Jinn from the plane of air sometimes come here to hunt. Most of the plane consists of a constant thunderstorm, but near the plane of air the storms begin to dissipate a bit, and near the plane of positive energy the storms are replaced by a solid sheet of rippling energy. The gateway into the plane of positive energy is known as the Tower of Storms. The nice thing about the plane of lightning, also known as the plane of storms, the vengeful land, or the great illumination, is that the air is safe to breathe. But despite that, it's still regarded as the most dangerous of all the quasi-planes on account of the constant lightning. Any metal, at least the size of a dagger, automatically gets struck by lightning once every 10 minutes, taking 1d8 times 10 damage. Even if you're not in possession of any metal, you still have a 10% chance of being struck by lightning every 10 minutes. You've also got a substantial chance of going deaf if you get struck. Radiance. The quasi-elemental plane of Radiance sits between the plane of fire and the plane of positive energy. This plane is essentially empty, except for the light in the occasional radiant method. But what a light it is! Those who have been here report that this plane contains a beauty so immense that it's worth losing your eyes for. Every color ever imagined, and even those yet to be imagined, can be found here, burning with painful splendor. This plane contains the heart of light, a tower of blue light standing at the border to the positive energy plane, where miraculous healing becomes possible. The plane itself has some unusual and useful properties. Steel forged here burns with the light of the sun, and mirrors created in this plane reflect more than just light. Despite being a plane of fathomless beauty, this plane isn't very welcoming to strangers. First off, if you don't bring some heavy-duty eye protection, you're going to go blind. Second, it's as hot as the plane of fire is, so you're going to need protection from the heat to avoid bursting into flame and dying shortly thereafter. And lastly, there's not much in the way of things to stand on. Gravity works just like the plane of air, except much like the planes of smoke and lightning, you don't have much solid ground here. Mineral. The quasi-elemental plane of Mineral sits between the plane of earth and the plane of positive energy. This is the goal of every treasure seeker in the multiverse. An endless supply of priceless gems, as well as more practical minerals such as iron, can be found here. However, this plane does a pretty good job of keeping its treasures unmolested. It's a realm of razor-sharp crystals and deadly jagged edges, plus more than a few territorial creatures who don't want to see you run off with their riches. There's also the Tower of Lead, said to be the greatest forge in existence, located right on the border to the plane of positive energy. It's not just the sharp edges everywhere that make navigating this place hard, which, by the way, deal 1d4 damage every minute spent moving. It's also the fact that this plane is very much like the plane of Earth in its configuration. There's no surface, no lowest layer, barely any open spaces, just solid mineral, filled with creatures who can navigate this place much better than you. And there's also the fossilization. Each day, every outsider must succeed on a saving throw or be turned to stone, or possibly precious gems. Steam. The quasi-elemental plane of Steam sits between the plane of water and the plane of positive energy. Honestly, the plane of mist would be a better name, as it isn't hot here. It's actually quite cool. It's also not very pleasant. This plane is the nightmare of all the people who say that they hate the word moist. The mist, or steam here, is thick and cloying and seeps into everything. It's so bad, in fact, that even though you're not swimming in anything, you run into a serious risk of drowning to death. As you move closer to the plane of water, the mist turns into something like a bubbly ocean. Towards the plane of positive energy, the droplets of water in the air become finer and finer until you reach the gleaming tower of ice, the top of which can hardly be seen. This tower plays a vital role for alchemists in the creation of powerful potions. Aside from the possibility of drowning, this plane is relatively safe, and breathing is possible in most places. You don't have to worry about extreme temperatures, and you don't have to worry too much about dangerous creatures either. Mist and steam methods reside here, naturally, as do a number of merid. The configuration of this plane is much like the plane of air, though all movement is slowed due to the thick mist, which also greatly reduces visibility. Vacuum. The quasi-elemental plane of Vacuum, also known as the plane of nothing, sits between the plane of air and the plane of negative energy. There is almost truly nothing in this plane. No air, no light, no warmth, no surface, no objects, no matter. It is a void. Well, there are at least two things. There is air near the border of the plane of air, but once you leave that behind, the atmosphere thins until nothing remains. And on the other end of the spectrum, at the border to the plane of negative energy, the Doomguard have built the Citadel Exhalis, portal of the last breath, drifting by a thread from the plane of negative energy. Many members of the Doomguard and the Dustmen spend their lives searching for a doorway to the plane of Vacuum, as it embodies their ultimate goal, true death and nothingness. This is a bring-your-own-air type of plane. If you do forget that, you'll suffocate immediately. But getting around isn't too bad. It's accomplished through thought alone. But just like the energy planes, what's really the point of moving if there's nothing to move to? Unlike those planes, there aren't any creatures native to this plane at all, though some say things do live here. immaterial things, essentially undetectable beings of pure thought. Some even say that the thoughts that live here enter the brains of unsuspecting outsiders. Ash. The quasi-elemental plane of Ash sits between the plane of fire and the plane of negative energy. Towards the edge of the plane of fire, the flames die out, leaving cooling ashes in their place. Moving farther away, the air grows thicker and thicker with ash, until even the burnt earth beneath your feet gives way, and you're soon swimming in ash. It's a near lifeless plane of soot and charcoal, the only natural inhabitants being ash mephits. Long ago, the Doomguard built Citadel Cavidius, a massive skull fortress on the border to the negative energy plane. But almost as long ago, this citadel was taken by Vecna to serve as his prison and stronghold. To replace it, the Doomguard built the crumbling citadel. While you might imagine the plane of Ash to be hot, it actually ends up being a very cold place, due to the fact that the cooling cinders sap the warmth from your body, causing 2d6 damage every 10 minutes. Close to the plane of fire, you can move around quite normally, just as you can on that plane. But as you move away from that border, the quantities of ash become so great that you have to swim through it. Like many of the planes, there's no air here either. You also have to worry about wandering pockets of negative energy, which have the same damaging effects as that plane. Dust. The quasi-elemental plane of Dust sits between the plane of Earth and the plane of negative energy. At the border to the plane of Earth, the whole place is an open expanse of dusty ground. As you move farther, the dust piles up so that you have to wade through it. It becomes thick and pulls against you. When you get near the plane of negative energy, it becomes a sea of abrasive particles that's painful to swim through. The Doomguard have a citadel on each of the negative quasi-elemental planes. Here, though, the tower known as Citadel Alluvius, sitting all by itself in a sea of dust, is their favorite one. That's because many of the Doomguard consider the plane of dust to be the embodiment of the end of the universe that they strive for. Perfect entropy. The plane of dust is similar to the plane of ash in many ways, but the cold here isn't as intense. It's still not a pleasant place to be, though. Travelers to this place will notice that the plane tries to break down one's body into dust, causing 2d6 damage per day. This damage cannot be healed while on the plane, and if you lose all your hit points, your body dissipates into nothingness. The plane breaks down objects even faster. There's also the wildlife to contend with, as the plane of dust is surprisingly well populated with creatures such as dunestalkers and dust mephits. The creatures that live here live miserable lives and long for solid forms, making the bodies of outsiders look particularly inviting. Salt. The quasi-elemental plane of Salt sits between the plane of water and the plane of negative energy. Near the plane of water, this place begins as an incredibly bitter and salty sea. As you move inward, the water becomes thicker with minerals and tiny crystals of salt, until there's no water left. Go too far in, and you run the risk of becoming completely encrusted in salt. At a certain point, you can't travel any further, at least not by any normal means, as the whole plane becomes a solid mass of salt. The Doomguard have carved a pocket out of this mass of crystalline mineral on the border of the negative energy plane, known as Citadel Sealt. The plane of Salt is considered by many to be the worst quasi-elemental plane because of the fact that it sucks all the moisture out of all who enter. Travelers to the plane take 46 points of damage per day as their bodies dehydrate, and this damage cannot be healed while on the plane. That and the pockets of negative energy that can be found in all the dark quasi-planes are the biggest hazards, as the only known creatures that live here are salt mephits. But of course, there's no air here, and any water you have or create becomes immediately undrinkable. Those are all the inner planes. My personal favorite is the plane of Vacuum. I like to think that in D&D, all thoughts originate from the plane of Vacuum, filling the heads of travelers to the plane or leaking out through the borders. Though I suppose if the ordeal plane exists, then all thought might originate there instead. There's a quote that goes, "If you trace an idea back to its source, eventually you will discover that it came from nothing, and chances are, the greater the idea, the more directly it came from there." Of course, there's more I could have said about each of these planes, especially if I would have taken from other sources, such as other editions of D&D. But as I said in the beginning, this video is just about Planescape, as it originally existed. I do plan on making a video or two about the Planescape campaign setting for 5th edition, but I haven't read it yet. If I left out anything that you think is important or interesting about one of the inner planes, let me know down in the comments. And thank you for watching.